Welcome back to Colombia Business News Recap from Finance Colombia. There is a lot going on. Let's get right into it. Colombia goes to the polls next Sunday, May 31st. And this election isn't just about who sits in Casa de Nariño for the next 4 years. For Colombians and anyone who has ties to Colombia, a stake in the country's prosperity, trade, capital, or operations in this country, the outcome represents three completely different economic realities, and frankly, three different versions of Colombia itself. Welcome to Colombia Business News. I'm Lauren Moss, Executive Editor of Finance Colombia. Today we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to go long because this election deserves it. We're going to walk through the three frontrunners, Iván Cepeda, Paloma Valencia, and Abelardo de la Espriella, across every dimension that matters to our audience: security, business climate, foreign investment, foreign policy, corruption, press freedom, the oil and mining sectors, the judiciary, and yes, we're going to address some of the other uncomfortable questions that other outlets have been dancing around. Who does organized crime fear the most? Is Cepeda really just Petro 2.0? Is Valencia just another Álvaro Uribe sock puppet? Is de la Espriella too close to the very criminals he says he wants to lock up? And which of these three, if any, comes remotely close to a small government civil libertarian? Let's get into it. Before we analyze the candidates, let's level set on the polling because the numbers moved dramatically in the final week, and the story of this race is no longer what it was even 10 days ago. Iván Cepeda has led this race from the beginning. That hasn't changed, but his ceiling and the race for second place have both shifted in ways that matter enormously. And also, to be clear, to say that Iván Cepeda has led the race is very far from saying that the majority of Colombians are behind him or his movement. It doesn't really work that way. You have, right now, I think you have about 6 candidates left. You had even more. And Colombia has 2 rounds of voting. So at the beginning, if nobody gets more than 50%, they go to a runoff, a second round, and the top 2 candidates, it doesn't matter if they're right or left or whatever, just the top 2 candidates then face each other for the final countdown. And so Cepeda benefits from a consolidated left that kind of decided to get behind him. He's also allied with the incumbent, and there is, you don't see the split that you have on the right with Abelardo de la Espriella, and then also Paloma Valencia, who to some degree split the same voter base, and that would be those that oppose the Colombia Humana project or the Pacto Histórico party of Gustavo Petro and his ally Cepeda. So, like I said, the ceiling and the race for second place have shifted quite a bit. And so the most recent numbers that we have, the CONDOR aggregator, which runs a weighted average across 6 polling firms, weighting recent surveys more heavily, puts the race as of May 23rd at Cepeda, 36.3%, de la Espriella, 29.1%, Valencia, 16.7%. The individual polls behind that average tell an even more dramatic story. Invamer, Colombia's most established polling firm, surveyed 3,800 people across 152 municipalities, and a municipality in Colombia is almost more analogous to a county in the U.S. because you'll have a city, but then the surrounding area will be part of that. So you might live in a rural area, or you might live out in the middle of nowhere, and you're still going to belong to some municipality, even though you look around and in the English sense of the words of municipality, we think about a city or a metro area. And the cities are municipalities in Colombia, but rural areas are assigned to one. So they're really more closely translated as a county, if you will, because every city, at least in the U.S., is in a county, but not every county has a city or a real city. They might have a town or county seat. Anyway, so Invamer surveyed 3,800 people across 152 municipalities between May 13th and 20th. According to their numbers, Cepeda had 44.6% of the vote, de la Espriella 31.6%, Valencia 14.0%. The CNC, the Centro Nacional de Consultoría, published a survey conducted May 22nd and 23rd, literally last week. Cepeda, 33.4%, De la Espriella, 30.9%, Valencia, 12.6%. Compare those to the Fundación Genesis Crea poll from May 4th through 11th, just 2 to 3 weeks ago, which had Cepeda at 35.1%, Valencia at 25.4%, and De la Espriella at 21.6%. So you see what's happening. In roughly 3 weeks, De la Espriella has gone from 21% to 31%. Valencia has collapsed from 25% to between 12 and 14%. This is not polling noise. This is a measurable multi-survey trend. Paloma, Valencia is in free fall. And I'll tell you anecdotally, some people that I know who have been staunch Uribistas, let's say people that have been traditional Uribe supporters, are sending me in WhatsApp memes and campaign stuff supporting Espriella, which is surprising in some cases because some of these people have been super staunch Uribistas. Where I live, which is literally 5 minutes away from Uribe's house, from Alvaro Uribe's residence in Rio Negro, Colombia, normally this area is super hardcore Uribista. Not every single person, of course, but this is literally his neighborhood. People know him personally. But if I go outside right now, all I see are Abelardo de la Espriella bumper stickers. They get these big bumper stickers that cover up the whole back windows of these cars, not these little old style bumper stickers. And so these people have come out in a big way. And this is anecdotal because you can go to some other municipality, some other part of the country or some other neighborhood and see something completely different. But Abelardo de la Espriella is surging. The right-wing vote is consolidating, just not behind the candidate the traditional right-wing establishment preferred. And here's the thing that's going to determine everything about the next 4 years of Colombian history. The runoff math changes depending upon who faces Cepeda. The Genesis Crea runoff data from earlier this month showed that if Valencia faced Cepeda, she won 49.1% to 44.7%. Why? There are people who find her, let's take a moderate, who might be kind of freaked out or scared of Espriella as a political unknown, and they might say, well, with Valencia, we know what we're going to get. And so there are people who either may stay home or just be too freaked out by the unpredictability of having a political outsider. And so Valencia is going to be more appealing to moderate voters than Espriella, who has run on this kind of patria and patriotism and family and all these and religion, even though he's kind of, I think, just came to religion right before, if I remember correctly, right before he decided to, or right before he announced he was running for president. He has his, Mr. Family and Religion has his own brand of rum out there. So, I mean, I like rum. I'm not saying that's bad, but I find it curious. So anyway, the point is that Paloma Valencia was the strongest candidate against Cepeda. She won 49.1% to 44.7%. Again, this is polling in a second round, but the Guarumo Ecoanalytica survey found Cepeda loses all runoff scenarios, including against De la Espriella. The numbers disagree. What they do agree on is that neither right-wing candidate is a guaranteed winner in the second round, and consolidation is happening whether the Centro Democrático establishment likes it or not. Now, an important caveat on polling methodology. Atlas Intel, which published the most dramatic De la Espriella numbers, showing him at nearly 33% versus Valencia at 16.7%, is currently under investigation by Colombia's National Electoral Council for potential methodology violations and could face suspension. There have been some modifications and some legal changes, and the government, the current government, has tried to, I won't go so far, and honestly, I haven't looked into it very carefully. I don't want to say that it's like so far as political tampering, even though some people may think so, but the government has tried to put some guardrails around the polling methodology. Now, you can argue against that and say that violates free speech, and you can make that argument. You can also say that it prevents the psychological tampering in the way that polls can be abused, but that's the case. So we're treating their data with the appropriate skepticism, but in the trend, in every other poll, Invamer, CNC, and the Condor Aggregate all point in the same direction. De la Espriella is up, Valencia is down. Two candidates who were polling at low single digits, former Senator Clara Lopez and former Chocó Governor Luis Gilberto Murillo, who also served in the past government. He was the foreign minister, and he also was the ambassador to the U.S. At one point, he was a U.S. citizen, actually. He had been the governor, like I mentioned, of Chocó. They threatened him because he was trying to clean up corruption. At least this is how the story goes. He fled to the United States. He ended up he worked as a bar bouncer for a while, actually. But he ended up becoming he advanced rapidly and got into think tanks and these kind of intellectual things. Interesting guy. He went to college in Russia. His wife is Russian. And so, he's been all over the place in Russia and the U.S. Interesting guy. I don't know him. I've never met him. I'd love to talk to him. But anyway, he withdrew along with Clara Lopez, who was also running, former senator. And they have both endorsed Ivan Cepeda. Those withdrawals modestly consolidate the left, but haven't dramatically really changed Cepeda's numbers, which suggests that most of the voters were already being counted in his column. Now, the bottom line, no candidate is hitting 50% plus one on May 31st next week. We're going into a runoff on June 21st, and right now the race for second place, which determines whether Cepeda wins the presidency or loses it, looks like it's breaking towards De la Espriella. We've covered this race extensively at financecolombia.com, including the peculiar absence of traditional debates. Cepeda has refused to participate in events organized by major media, arguing the formats lack neutrality. Former Bogota Mayor Claudia Lopez called that out directly, saying Cepeda simply doesn't want to answer for the failures of Paz Total. That's the Total Peace initiative that Gustavo Petro ran on and has kind of administered in his presidency. But the thing that's clear is that Cepeda, who's buddies with Petro, is largely the architect of the Total Peace, the Paz Total. Make of that what you will. What it means practically is that this campaign has been fought primarily on social media and digital platforms, which is precisely where De la Espriella, with his combative viral style, has had the most devastating effectiveness. Now, if we talk about security, the guerrillas, the cartels, and who the armed groups actually fear, the security is the number one voter concern in Colombia this year, and for good reason. The collapse of Gustavo Petro's Paz Total, which has been a fiasco. Parts of Colombia are now more dangerous than they were 20 years ago. Jamundi, south of Cali. I remember visiting in 2025, 2026, and thinking, wow, Jamundi, this is a nice place. The first time I ever had the cholado, which is a kind of Colombian salpicon. It's like a fruit cocktail kind of thing. It has, it's really delicious. It'll make you fat because it's full of fruit, and then they put condensed milk over it, and it's delicious. It's a decadent dessert or treat, but you could say, well, I'm eating fruit, so it counts as healthy. But anyway, I remember visiting Jamundi and thinking, wow, this would be a nice place to live. Today, it's a danger zone. It's a no-go zone. If you're not a local resident, forget it. Tourist, no way. It's just dangerous because it's been taken over by armed groups and mafias, and it's just no longer a safe place to go. Norte de Santander, I have a good friend. His wife is from that area near the in Cucuta and near the Venezuela border. It's dangerous now. You can't go there. You can go if you want to, but you can't go safely and prudently. We used to drive between Medellin and the Atlantic coast. That drive that I would make without hesitation 5 years ago, I would think 2 or 3 times about going now. And I certainly wouldn't go in a nice vehicle or anything that attracted attention. The security situation is genuinely worse, and this total peace nonsense is failing. That's my editorializing. That's my opinion, but you can look at the numbers and back it up, because the paz total, or this total peace strategy, has left a security vacuum that armed groups have filled with remarkable speed. The ELN launched a major offensive against FARC dissidents in Norte de Santander, where I just mentioned, over there by Cucuta and the Venezuelan border, at the start of 2025, massacring civilians in Catatumbo in what Inside Crime, which is a great organization, go and check them out, insidecrime.org, described as one of the worst atrocities in the post-2016 peace agreement era. Where's this total peace at? It's total chaos. In Chocó, in Antioquia, the ELN and the Clan del Golfo, also known as the AGC, or Autodefensas Gaitanistas de Colombia, poor guy Gaitan, who was a presidential candidate who got assassinated, I'm sure he would have nothing to do with these people. But anyway, they're locked in a war over illegal gold mines and drug trafficking corridors. And Cauca, which is the next department south of where Cali is. Cali's in the state called, or the department called Valle de Cauca. Cauca is the name of the river that runs through these areas. And then south of there, you get into Cauca. So south of Cali and Jamundi, you keep going, you get Cauca, then you get into Nariño, and then you get close to the Ipiales, and you're down there on the Ecuador border. The FARC dissident factions have effectively created no-go zones. So where do the 3 candidates stand? Ivan Cepeda, like I mentioned, is the architect in every meaningful sense of Gustavo Petro's failed paz total, or total peace. That's what it is in Spanish. So I'm going to use that interchangeably rather than say both and slow us down like I'm doing right now, okay? So as the head of the Senate's Peace Commission, talking about Cepeda, he designed the legal and philosophical framework that gave the ELN, FARC dissidents, and even the Clan del Golfo, which is basically a non-political mafia group. They sort of came out of the right-wing paramilitary groups, but they really, they're not trying to, they don't have this dream or ideology of overthrowing the government in the way that the ELN and the FARC do. So anyway, so they're basically a mafia, okay? But Cepeda came up with this plan that gave them, we're going to talk to you and have dialogue and talk and stop, rather than wipe them out or put them in jail. So his approach, it's not military, it's structural. He argues that fighting foot soldiers while the financial heads of drug networks operate freely is a losing strategy, and there's a real academic body of work that supports that view. And I don't think anybody, even the detractors, are saying let them walk freely, but lock them up too, okay? And you could say, well, maybe some in the past they didn't do that, and you could be right. But still, Paz Total produced ceasefires that were violated, legal concessions that emboldened armed actors, this is very true, and a security landscape that got materially worse by almost every metric. Under a Cepeda presidency, negotiations continue. More talky. The military doesn't get more resources, it gets more restrictions. Paloma Valencia returns to this. It is kind of ironic because Paloma means dove. It also means pigeon, but Paloma is the word in Spanish for dove. And a dove is sort of related to a pigeon. But anyway, it's like peace dove, right? So it's a Paloma. Remember that song? It says, from way back in the 70s, and was like, Una Paloma Blanca, ooh, something like that. It was even popular in English. But anyway, so Paloma returns to the doctrine of what they call seguridad democrática, or democratic security, the framework that defined the URIBE era from 2002 to 2010. And that means expanded military presence, reestablishment of rural security networks, revoking political concessions made to criminal actors, and almost certainly a push to resume extraditions with the United States, which Petro suspended in a way that really pissed off Washington and gave cartel leadership a free pass from U.S. federal prosecution. Valencia's approach is institutional and sustained. It's not glamorous, but it produced measurable results under both Alvaro Uribe and Juan Manuel Santos. And even though Santos, people go, well, Santos got the Nobel Peace Prize and he negotiated with the FARC, and it really pissed off Alvaro Uribe, and all that's true. But Santos broke the back of the FARC, and so basically he almost had them completely extinct, and said, okay, now for those of you that are left, if you want your lives, you can survive and you can retire or whatever. But Santos was the defense minister under Uribe, and knew and had a track record of wiping these guerrillas out. The ELN and the FARC feared Santos. And so Santos, when he negotiated with them, he negotiated from a position of strength, and was basically like when the police have you surrounded and you're holed up somewhere, and the police are like, you can come out with your hands up and go to jail, or we're going to kill you. And when he negotiated, basically that was the position. They had the FARC on their last legs. And then Duque comes in and, bumbles around and basically was beholden to Uribe, and that actually allowed those armed actors to regain strength. And then under this total peace nonsense, they've completely flourished and blossomed. And so now we have less peace in Colombia than we did before. Abelardo de la Espriella is the loudest on this issue, and he's explicitly said, in my government, of course he said this in Spanish, in my government there will be no peace process, full stop. He advocates for a Nayib Bukele style. He's the president of El Salvador, and he's kind of basically locked up. I'm exaggerating, but it's like his detractors, let's put it this way, his detractors would say that it's a crime to be a young man, and he's locked up everybody from 18 to 30 in the country. That's not true. That's an overstatement, but there are real concerns about due process and civil rights. But anyway, that's kind of who you could say De La Espriella models himself after, is a Bukele. And he said so. Mega prisons, classification of guerrilla and cartel groups as foreign terrorist organizations, and sweeping military offensives. He talks about it with the confidence of a man who has spent his entire career getting people out of those exact systems. Remember, he's made all his money as a defense lawyer, and he has worked with very high profile not Joe Schmo criminal, but really high profile criminals. So here's the honest analysis. Who will armed groups actually fear? De La Espriella talks the toughest, but Colombia's criminal organizations have decades of experience reading political rhetoric versus institutional capacity. They don't fear speeches. They fear sustained, organized military pressure combined with functioning extradition pipelines. That's what Valencia brings, and that institutional apparatus, with its intelligence networks, rural military bases, and international cooperation agreements, is what actually dismantled the old AUC and hurt the FARC back in the 2000s. For the ELN in Norte de Santander, and for the EMC, the Estado Mayor Central, which is like the one of the main FARC dissident groups. You also have the Segunda Marquetalia. These dissidents, the people that did not want to agree to Santos's peace plan and said, no, we're going to keep fighting. We're not the FARC anymore, but they're like the FARC progenitor, the children or offsprings of what came out of the FARC. Okay, so for them, a Valencia presidency means a return to something that they already know how to fight, but genuinely cost them resources and territory. For the Clan del Golfo, extradition to the United States, remember they're the mafia group, the non-revolutionary bad guys, but they're still bad guys. Extradition to the United States is the single thing its leadership fears most. Valencia brings that back. De La Espriella, interestingly, would be more of kind of a wild card. His personal history with some of the very people he'd be fighting makes his credibility as a hardliner genuinely complicated, and we'll get to that in a moment. Now, what about the business climate? Who do employers actually want to win this next election? For Colombia's business community, the Petro years have been a prolonged stress test. A 23% minimum wage hike, labor reforms that dramatically increase costs for night shifts, weekends, and holidays. Colombia has 19 holidays, too. And if your holiday falls on a weekend, they make it on a Monday, so you get Monday off. And so, I mean, you can have somebody work on a Monday, but you've got all these extra pay, and they've also shortened the the work day, or not they shortened the work week. So like the like before it was anything over 48 hours you had to pay overtime, I think, and so now it's something like anything over 42 hours, I think it went down to. And you can say that's good or bad, but still, the point is that it makes employment in Colombia more expensive. And when you talk about the kind of large companies that can set up operations in different jurisdictions, the mom and pop business is stuck here. Like if you got a small dentist office or neighborhood grocery store, then you're stuck here. But if you're running call centers or, production or factories or something like that, you can just say, well, screw this. I'm going to go to Ecuador, or I'm going to go to Peru, or I'm going to go to Central America. So those formal jobs, if you make formal jobs too expensive, then, and of course there needs to be a give and take in this, and there needs to be a reasonable balance. But what happens is that Colombia already has something like 50% more or less of the employment is informal, because it's too expensive to employ people in the formal economy and give them all the social benefits that they need. Even when you want to, it's very difficult. In the bookkeeping, the accounting load, let's say, I've done this calculation just in the past being an employer, and it cost about 50, these were real numbers. It cost me, I used to have a business in Colombia, and I had almost 50 employees, and they were all 100% formal. And I did the math, and it cost my employment load was 55%. So that's to say, if I paid somebody, let's say, $10,000 a year, it cost me actually $15,500 a year to have that person on the payroll. That was my cost for that employee. So they still feel poor because I don't have money in my pocket, because how much of that actually gets to the employee is relatively modest, but the employer has all this cost, and that a lot of that goes to the government, of course, and all these other different schemes that they come up with. But still, an employer has to ask and say, who's going to create the environment that is most amenable to creating formal jobs in Colombia? If you want to put it that way. If you're Marxist, you're probably going to say, no, you're just going to screw the people, and well, you're not going to care anyway. Okay, so, but anyway, thinking about it from an employer standpoint, these under the current Petro administration, all of these laws and requirements and restrictions have increased the cost for employers. Corporate tax increases to fund social spending, a general regulatory environment described by ANDI. ANDI is what you call in Colombia a gremio, which is like an industry association. So in the U.S., you'd have a chamber of commerce. And in Colombia, they have a chamber of commerce, a Cámara de Comercio, but it means something different. That's where you go to register your business in Colombia. So a gremio is like a trade association. So ANDI is the Asociación Nacional de Empresarios de Colombia, and anybody can join. Like you go and you pay your dues, and they advocate for for business and industry, and have events and all the kinds of things that if you're in a place like the U.S., and they have these kinds of things in Europe and everywhere else in the world, but the kinds of things that your chamber of commerce would do. They have employee mixers and breakfast and trainings and bring in speakers and nice events and that kind of thing. But according to ANDI, the current administration has been hostile to private investment. Capital flight has been measurable. Foreign direct investment has dropped sharply in the extractive sector. I can tell you anecdotally, I used to get invited all the time to go and speak at a lot of these events, and where I'd present sometimes in English, sometimes in Spanish, whatever they wanted. But these events, I might have a different event every month. And we're media partners with Finance Colombia, or they want to speak, or whatever the case is. And we were just traveling domestically constantly. That's largely dried up. One of the industry events, it used to take place, if you guys know Bogota and the big Agora Convention Center, which is this huge convention center across from Corferias. And last year, the international event was in a hotel lobby because it had shrunk so much. A mining event that I that we're media partners with, and that we go, and I've spoken before, but most of the time they don't ask me to speak because I'm not a mining expert. But anyway, I've seen they're down about 50% with the size of how big they used to be because the interest has dried up. I've seen Colombian companies re-domicile. A large company that I know that's a manufacturer changed their headquarters to the United States. Fortunately for Colombians, their factories are still here, but legally they found it no longer convenient, and they're very patriotic people and Colombians, and they left Colombia, but legally, and when you think about it from kind of an investor relations standpoint, it doesn't make sense for them anymore. The uncertainty is just too much for them to overcome. Cepeda, Ivan Cepeda, continues this model. He has been one of the loudest legislative supporters of the labor reforms and the wage policies of Gustavo Petro. And under his administration, the state grows, social spending expands, taxation grows, and the regulatory burden on private enterprise increases. For companies already in Colombia with established operations, you can work within it possibly. If you've survived so far, you'll probably continue to survive. It's not Venezuela or anything crazy like that. For companies deciding whether to enter the market or expand, the calculus, I think, gets a little bit harder. Paloma, Valencia is the cleanest, clearest pro-business signal in this race as far as the traditional, I want to know what's coming. I want legislative certainty and that kind of thing. She's a technocrat who has spent a decade on economic policy in the Senate and understands that job creation requires corporate stability. Her vice presidential pick, I'm very, let's say, respectful of him because he used to run Juan Daniel Oviedo, former director of DANE. DANE is Colombia's official statistics agency. We don't quite have something similar in the U.S. because statistics comes from, you have like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and then you have the Congressional Budget Office, and you have all of these other different organizations that put out statistics. But in Colombia, you have the DANE, which is the something directed, come on, I forget what it stands for, but estadísticas. The E is for estadísticas, which is statistics. And it's basically Colombia's official, so unemployment or how many people are, let's say, youth pregnancy, or if you want to know how many women are employed or what the poverty level is or something like that. The DANE is where you would go first for those statistics. He's done a good job running that. I think he was on city council in Bogota before, but he's very well respected across sectors, across the political spectrum. He's respected as a technocrat, and I say that in the positive sense, not a polemic, crazy guy, but he actually was running for president, and then he came in really strong, and sort of like they have sort of like a primary election here, and he did really, really well. And so Paloma said, look, let's join forces, because it was clear he didn't have the machinery to win nationally. And what Paloma wanted to do, because he's not a right-wing guy, but by bringing him in, it kind of made the strategy, I think, was to make Paloma's campaign with the Uribistas more palatable to, let's say, centrist or people that were not hardcore right-wing people. So he's focused on removing he's an economist. So he really is, he understands how things work. Like I said, he's a technocrat in the positive sense. He's focused on removing structural market distortions, I think, according to what he says, streamlining public contracting, reducing the state's footprint, which is a good thing, I think, just my own personal bias. And I mean in things like fiscal concerns and taxation. Obviously, I think that the state needs more of a footprint in Colombia when it comes to, I was going to say keeping the peace. You can't keep the peace until you get the peace. But making Colombia safe for Colombians, first of all, which it is in places like Bogota and Medellin, but it is not in places like Catatumbo or Cauca or Buenaventura or parts of Chocó. So anyway, his presence on the ticket is a very deliberate signal to the business community. We know what we're doing. Notably, Oviedo has publicly identified as a member of the gay community, a historic first for a major right-wing ticket in Colombia. Now, Claudia Lopez is a lesbian. Her forgive me, I don't know if you're supposed to say wife or husband. I guess wife, has been in Congress. I think she just lost her ticket. She was a senator, I believe. But Claudia is openly a lesbian. We've had some other, and she was the mayor of Bogota. And so it's not so much like a new thing in Colombia, but on the right, it is. So, and that's a significant shift in the cultural DNA of the Centro Democrático, which can be thought of as one of the several right-wing parties in Colombia. Now, they haven't been like the conservative party, and people out there like their candidate, I forget his first name, Ordóñez, who was like this hardcore super church Opus Dei, strict, anti-gay, pro-family, anti-contraception kind of old style guy. But they've been kind of like, they certainly have not been out there cheerleading, or they're not the kind of party, I'm talking about the Centro Democrático, that would show up at the gay pride parade or something like that in the past. It seems like they've kind of mellowed out because it's just they're accepting the signs of the times and the changing society. Colombia is now relative to I would say the rest of Latin America as a whole, not every single country, but certainly when we include the Caribbean, Colombia is a relatively gay-friendly country. We went out to Santa Fe de Antioquia, my wife's hometown, last weekend, and it just happened to be, we didn't know what was going on, but it was like a huge, and this is a small rural town. You would have never seen this 20 years ago. Let alone 40 years ago, but there was like I don't know. I never did find out officially what it was, but there's like these super big rainbow flags and this stage, and they had some kind of concert and everything like that. And you didn't see, it wasn't like San Francisco. You didn't see people running around in tights and, with little twizzlers or you didn't see anything crazy, but they were acknowledging and having kind of like the gay pride or the gay acknowledgement day. I don't know what, like I said, I never found out exactly what was going on, but there's no way you would have seen that 20 years ago. So Colombia is, I mean, you see, it's like normal. I saw, dudes walking on the street holding their hands and everything. Now, it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't the Castro district of San Francisco or what is it called, Wilton Gardens down in Fort Lauderdale. But Colombia has certainly evolved with those respects. And so now for this guy to be on the ballot, and you don't really hear a lot of people. I think that De La Espriella made some kind of immature comment. But it's not a big campaign issue. It wasn't a big campaign issue when Claudia Lopez got elected. Some people didn't like it, but it wasn't like a big controversial thing. And it's not right now. Everybody's looking at this guy as a respected administrator and a respected vice presidential candidate. But anyway, the point is that Valencia is trying to build a coalition that goes beyond the traditional Uribista base. Now, getting back to De La Espriella, he's pro-business, but with a populist, protectionist flavor. People have compared him to Trump. I think that is accurate in some ways. De La Espriella actually has success at getting rich. Trump has success of taking his father's riches and losing most of it, and then he became a famous TV star, and that kind of got him money and kind of revived him as a public figure. But De La Espriella actually has been a successful defense lawyer who has become rich by defending rich defendants. Many of them you can clearly say are criminals. But, if you believe in the idea that everyone deserves competent defense, and I believe that, then you can't really say, well, you're a bad guy just because you're a defense lawyer. Because who knows? You may one day need a defense lawyer and you say, no, I don't, because I'm innocent. That's why you may need one, because you're innocent, right? I think the innocent people need one more than the guilty people, because you got to prove that you're innocent. But anyway, you're not supposed to. You're supposed to, the prosecutors are supposed to prove that you're guilty. But we know that in reality, that doesn't always work that way. In fact, it probably rarely works that way. But anyway, so one thing that I would give De La Espriella credit for is his choice of vice presidential running mate, who is Jose Manuel Restrepo. And he, I think, is an excellent choice from a market's perspective. He was a minister under Ivan Duque. I generally have a positive opinion of him. I think that he did a really good job. I don't think that Duque did a great job as president, but I do think that some of his ministers, including Jose Manuel Restrepo, are very competent and credible. And so that kind of gives some people some relaxation, I think, because they're like, well, we don't know if Espriella is a crazy guy or not, but this Jose Manuel Restrepo guy, he has a track record, and at least from an investment standpoint and a standpoint of things like Colombia's central bank and how to manage the treasury and how to manage the country's economy, he's seen as a cool head that would hopefully prevail under such an administration. He provides the same kind of institutional anchor that Oviedo does for Valencia. Restrepo's presence signals fiscal discipline and deregulation, but De La Espriella himself adds volatility. And so his combative style, his history of public outburst, and his previous associations, and we'll get into that even more, introduce a risk factor that does not exist with Valencia. The bottom line for employers and, let's say, multinational business people is that Valencia is the most predictable and institutionally safe bet. De La Espriella could be very good or very chaotic, depending upon which version prevails should he become president. Cepeda means more of what you've had since 2022. The difference, I think, is that Cepeda, in my opinion, is a lot more intelligent than Gustavo Petro, and I'm not trying to be bombastic or insult the president or anything like that, but Gustavo Petro has all these super Bolshevik ideas, but he has not been able to implement them because he has not been very good at either making his case or navigating his ideas through Congress. And Congress and the courts have thwarted him. He's been trying to get this kind of constitutional convention held where they want to rewrite the Colombian constitution, and he has all these ideas of what he wants to do, but he hasn't been able to get that anywhere. His tax reform failed, his education reform failed, his health reform has failed, and he's really flailed about. I think Cepeda might have those same basic ideas, but be a much more eloquent promoter of them, and also understand how to navigate politically and get those things and get through a legislative agenda. And if you don't like his ideas, then you would see that as dangerous and maybe not a good thing, the fact that he would be more effective. If you do like those ideas, then, well, there you go. What about foreign investment, oil and mining? And I think this is the axis that matters most for international capital, and the divergence between the candidates is as stark as it gets. Cepeda follows the Petro playbook precisely: mandatory transition away from fossil fuels, heavy restrictions or outright bans on new oil and gas exploration contracts. And that's an industry that's already kind of moribund, even though Colombia has really relied on that for the bulk of his hard currency, foreign exchange. And Colombia now has debt has skyrocketed under Petro. And now the country is going to need to get dollars to start paying this debt back. And right now the dollar is really depressed in Colombia, and so the peso's kind of high. But as the Colombian government needs to get their hands on dollars, and in the coming years they're going to need to get their hands on more and more dollars, and with the lack of that hard currency coming in from petroleum exports, the government's going to fight. Whoever is the president is going to find themselves in a pickle. I think one of the dangers that might happen is there are going to be some economic reckonings in the next few years. And let's suppose that Valencia wins or De La Espriella wins. Then the people in the Pacto Histórico or Colombia Humana, the Petrista movements, are going to say, look, there's receptions and the recessions and the prices are high. This happened during the Duque administration. They called out for all these rallies and marches, and it wasn't, Duque screwed up a lot of things, but the pricing, the price of the dollar wasn't his fault. He didn't do that, or whatever the inflation rate is. There are some things that the president does, but these are just macroeconomic factors. And the Petro camp came out and made all this noise and called on all these. They love to call for these marches, and it's not that they actually call for riots, but sometimes I think that they call for marches in a way that they know that some people are going to act up. But the point is that if Cepeda wins, then they're not going to be able to blame the evil capitalists, right? Because this is what we've had for the stage has been set now in the past 4 years. And so it's going to be really interesting as a journalist and as an analyst to watch and see what happens. So with Cepeda, you're going to continue with heavy restrictions or on new. There's not going to be any, I don't think, new oil and gas exploration contracts. You're going to see severe environmental licensing, no fracking. Forget it. There's not going to be anything like that. Hydraulic fracturing. Severe cutback or restrictions on open pit mining, and maybe my hunch would be also on underground mining as well. I don't know. Steering foreign direct investment exclusively towards green hydrogen, ecotourism, and smallholder agriculture. Smallholder agriculture is a good idea, as well as big farms, because of the efficiencies that you get. Ecotourism is, of course, a good idea. I don't think anybody's against that. Or hell, even if you're going to build a resort somewhere, that's fine too, because, then you're going to bring all this money into the country. That's what, the Bahamas is rich because of a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is because of the tourism. You look at St. Bart's and the higher end tourism that they bring in, or the success that the Dominican Republic has had with tourism, or Jamaica with resorts. So ecotourism is great, and I love going to these little resorts. We just went to beautiful place, Hotel Isla Mucura. We'll put the link in there for you. And actually, they are offering a discount if you mention Finance Colombia, but you've got to contact them directly. So check out them. I'll put a little video snippet at the end of this publication, because they, I believe, they're not a sponsor right now, but actually may become one. But anyway, all of these little places, we love to get out into these kind of wellness. My wife likes all this kind of wellness stuff, and so I do too, but she's like super into it. And we go out to these nature resorts outside of Santa Marta and that Sierra Nevada, the Pico Cristobal Colon mountain over there is beautiful up in there. And there's so much of that. So absolutely, ecotourism is a good thing. But tourism, any kind of honest, clean tourism that doesn't involve any kind of vice, I think is good for Colombia. I'm glad to see that people like Fico, the mayor of Medellin, is cracking down. Federico Gutierrez is cracking down on kind of the vice-oriented tourism. There's no place for that, in my opinion, here in Colombia. But anyway, a Cepeda presidency is a continuation of uncertainty, and in some cases, a managed wind down of the Colombian portfolios when it comes to the traditional extractive industries like mining or petroleum. So just this month, Finance Colombia reported that Ecopetrol's president, Ricardo Roa, has been formally charged in connection with alleged campaign spending violations in Petro's 2022 presidential run. And that's a case that's going to land in whoever's lap that ends up in Casa Nariño in August. That's the kind of August 7th. It's like their inauguration day, and that's when they changed the president. So that's the kind of institutional entanglement that defines this era. Valencia views oil and mining as the crown jewels of Colombia's macroeconomic stability. She's explicit. Colombia cannot afford to walk away from the hydrocarbon revenues while the alternative energy infrastructure doesn't yet exist. According to her and her campaign, she'll actively encourage foreign direct investment into petroleum exploration. She's open to the fracking debate and will remove the adversarial stance the Petro government has taken towards the sector. For gold and copper mining, she favors clearing the licensing backlog that has blocked billions of dollars in investment. So what that means is that mining is legal in Colombia, and existing mines are producing gold and silver, and there's a little bit of copper mining taking place. There's some precious metals, or not precious metals, but well, those are gold and silver, but rare earth, kind of early stage mining that's taking place, or let's say in the exploratory phase in Colombia. And what happens is, so you want to get a mine. Now, Colombia, unlike, and I mentioned the U.S. because I know how the U.S. works. In the U.S., if you own a piece of land, you own everything down underneath it, in theory, down to the center of the earth. Okay, unless you sell off your mineral rights, which you can do. You can separate them from the physical possession of the land. You can sell off your timber rights, and so you don't own the trees that are on your land. But in Colombia, as in a lot of countries, like I think Mexico's like this as well, the government owns everything under the ground. So you might own a farm or a ranch or a house or whatever, but if there's gold in the ground or oil, you're not allowed to go take it out. You know, now I remember working on a farm back in Ohio when I was a teenager, and we had like 4 oil wells. And so the owners of the farm owned all the oils, and they pumped the oil out and they sold it. Now the people came and they maintained the wells, and then the truck came and they, you know, counted how many gallons they got out of the wells and paid them whatever the price was, but you own it. Okay, it's yours. You dig a hole and there's gold down there, it's yours. Not in Colombia. In Colombia, the government owns that, and so you do get some compensation in some ways, like, well, actually, sometimes you don't. But basically, if the mine needs access over your physical land on the top, then they either have to buy the land from you or negotiate with you. But whatever's underneath, you don't really have any say in that in Colombia. So the government sells that off. So what happens is people apply for like a license, okay, and you're complying with the law. But if the government doesn't want to issue you a license, let's say for petroleum, or let's say to make a gold mine or for coal or whatever, then they just don't approve the license. And they don't tell you no. I mean, they can sometimes, but they'll just sit on it and they just won't approve it. And that is a problem that we have right now. And actually, this problem even goes back to the Santos administration. De la Espriella goes even further. He proposes essentially deregulating the environmental licensing process for major extraction projects, arguing that Colombia's economic sovereignty takes precedence over what he describes as radical environmental mandates. So, again, people like to make comparisons between him and Trump, and that does sound very much like what Trump would say. Now, I think that there's a reasonable middle ground. You don't want to go and debauch the environment, but then you have some tree huggers who would make everybody into a vegan, and you can never, you know, wear leather again. I think that most people are probably in the middle somewhere. Now, you can take these things as you will. It seems to me sort of that maybe Valencia would be, and this is just a prediction. It's not reality and it's not 100% certain, but she might be the kind of reasonable candidate. And then Espriella is the kind of, like they would say, drill, baby, drill candidate. And then Cepeda is like going to be more of the same restrictive environment that we have right now. So for a mining or energy executive, Espriella might sound fantastic. The practical implementation question is whether a president de la Espriella has the institutional coherence and political capital to actually deliver deregulation versus simply generating noise about it. Remember, he got on the ballot by signatures, which is pretty impressive. You got to give him credit for this. He has no political party, so there's no, like, he doesn't have any political machine. He doesn't have a congressional delegation. He doesn't really have people in Congress or like a movement. So like if Valencia wins, you have the Centro Democrático people in Congress. If Cepeda wins, he has a whole bunch of his Pacto Historical people in Congress. Now they don't have a majority, but you have a block of Congress people, of legislators who know what they're doing. And that's the case with Cepeda and with Paloma Valencia. De la Espriella has never held any kind of political office before, as far as I know, and he doesn't have a traditional base or block of allies in the Congress right now. So, you know, there's what they say, and this is for all three of them, and then there's what they're actually able to deliver, and those are two different things, because remember, politics is the art of the possible. Now let's talk about foreign policy. Pro-NATO or pro-BRICS? Colombia has historically been one of Washington's most reliable Latin American partners. Certainly in South America, I would say that the U.S. has had strong economic ties with Chile, but Colombia has been the most consistent political ally of the United States. And Petro broke that tradition aggressively, aligning with Venezuela's Maduro, deepening ties with Beijing, and publicly antagonizing Washington on several occasions. Go and look in financecolombia.com. He did something like a jackass move, in my opinion. He went to the U.S., and he went to New York, and they were unveiling some kind of statue or something. And he calls on he doesn't like Trump, and that's fine. I don't like Trump either. But he calls on U.S. troops to what I forget the exact wording. It's in Finance Colombia, to revolt or to turn it or to disobey. That's illegal. That's kind of like, I don't know if it's treason or insurrection or whatever. It's illegal to do. It goes beyond the First Amendment that we have as Americans in the U.S. But here you have a foreign president that goes to the U.S. and calls on U.S. troops to disobey the U.S. government. And I think that's beyond the pale. And so what's the FAFO? You mess around and find out. So the Trump administration put him on, I thought this was kind of hilarious, the Clinton list. And there's all kind of irony in all these names in the Clinton list and all this stuff like that, right? But the president of Colombia's, his own credit cards in Colombia from Colombian banks got shut off and wouldn't work. And, his visa got revoked. And when you're on this Clinton list, he's got all these protections as president now, but when he's no longer president, and of course, that's when they really get into the gravy train and make money because they fly off to these conferences and they give speeches to these think tanks and these fundraisers. Ivan Duque, I think, lives in the U.S. now, somewhere, a former president, even though he spent most of his adult life in the U.S. But Petro can't go and just buy a plane ticket as a private citizen now. And his his interior minister, Armando Benedetti, admitted that they were terrified when the U.S. went in there and snatched Nicolas Maduro out of Caracas. They were terrified, and he admitted that he stayed up at night fearing, troops coming down out of the helicopters, because that demonstrated how easy that was and those capabilities. And I can tell you that Colombia is not set up, and this is not a criticism, it's just the way that their police and defense works, is not really set up to defend against that kind of operation. And like I said, it's not a criticism. They don't have to, because there's not that kind of risk. There's no neighbors that are a threat to Colombia. Ecuador, even though they're having this little pissing match right now with the president. Brazil, Colombia has Panama, Colombia has peaceful relationships with its neighbors. But anyway, Petro spent his last 4 years deepening ties with Beijing, publicly antagonizing Washington. And Cepeda is deeply committed to the global South multipolar vision. He would maintain standard diplomatic channels with the United States and European Union. He's a lot more savvy and responsible than to go off, in my opinion, you never know, and start saying crazy stuff and, making big. Colombia needs the U.S. in a lot of ways, and I don't mean that in any kind of bad way, but their bilateral relationship benefits both countries to a large degree. And so I don't think that Cepeda is going to blow up anything overtly, but strategically, he deepens ties with China and Russia. He maintains the Maduro adjacent posture, and he aligns with the regional left, people like Mexico's Morena successors, Sheinbaum, who's in power right now, Lula, who's in power in Brazil, Bolivia, and of course Cuba in the Caribbean. And Bolivia actually right now has a president who's not a leftist, but is kind of in a precarious position, and I don't know how that's going to resolve, because the supporters of Evo Morales are protesting and in the streets and trying to get the current president to resign. So Bolivia is something to keep an eye on and see what happens. But anyway, for U.S. companies operating in Colombia, this doesn't really mean immediate disruption, but it does mean Colombia becomes less of a reliable interlocutor on security cooperation, counter-narcotics intelligence sharing, and trade dispute resolution. Valencia makes the pivot back to the West explicit and enthusiastic. She positions Colombia as the primary democratic bulwark against authoritarian entrenchment in Latin America. That's a role that the country played under Uribe and to a lesser extent under Santos and Duque. She prioritizes repairing ties with Washington, which were significantly damaged under Petro, and would push for expanded bilateral free trade agreements and Western security intelligence sharing. So for people who like that kind of thing, it's kind of like back to the good old days. So Colombia has traditionally, over the last 40 years, really cooperated with Washington on security. The U.S. has been very generous with Colombia in terms of foreign aid and defense support and training. When I lived in Miami, I remember going to Dolphin Mall, which is out there by the U.S. Southcom headquarters in the Southern Command headquarters in Doral, a suburb of Miami. And you always would see not just Colombian, but other military people from Latin American militaries who were, in uniform. And they're not that they're doing anything. It's not like that old school of the Americas. I think they used to be in Central America. They're not doing like training to be mean to people or anything like that. But they're just in meetings for, bilateral and multilateral security cooperation and those kinds of things. And so what will happen is they're about to fly back, and maybe if they have their wives with them, they go to Dolphin Mall like everybody does from Latin America. If you go to Miami, I'm kind of being facetious, but it's also kind of true. And you buy it. Dolphin Mall is a great big outlet mall in the Miami suburbs. And it's, I used to shop there. I still shop there when I go back to Miami. But you always see these military people, and they're in uniform because they're about to fly back, but they go to Dolphin Mall so they can get in some shopping and go to TJ Maxx and Marshalls and the Nike store, and everybody's out there, and get the iPhone store and all that stuff like that. But that relationship is very, very important. And, basically under Valencia, you could expect it to be, like I said, just back to the good old days. I don't mean anything from like 1950s when anything nefarious or anything like that, but really just the harmonious bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Colombia. For U.S. and European investors, a Valencia presidency restores a familiar and reliable operating environment. De la Espriella is the most strikingly pro-American, or maybe it would be better to say pro-Trump candidate, and there's a difference between the two. So let's say, I don't know that he's more pro-American than, let's say, Valencia, but he's more pro-Trump. Perhaps in the history of modern Colombian presidential campaigns, Maria Fernanda Cabal, who is a senator, and she was early in the candidate, she got really, really angry and upset because she wanted to be Uribe's chosen candidate, but he went with Valencia, which electorally was smart because Cabal had no chance of winning in any kind of general election. But she's a super Trump guy, Trump person, Trump supporter woman. And but anyway, like I mentioned, De la Espriella has publicly aligned himself with the MAGA movement. The newspaper or the investigative reporting, it's really kind of like they do more than that. It's one of the Colombian publications, La Silla Vacía, which means the empty chair in Spanish, reported that he or entities linked to his network, De la Espriella, have donated more than $90,000 to the U.S. Republican Party, which raises its own set of questions, frankly, about where his funding is coming from and what the reciprocal expectations are. Now, De la Espriella may hold a U.S. citizenship. I'm pretty sure he has an Italian citizenship. But in the U.S., it's, for the most part, illegal for non-citizens to contribute to presidential campaigns. So I don't know what's going on there. But he takes an explicitly hostile stance towards China, Russia, and Venezuela. And when I say Venezuela, I think it's towards the regime in Venezuela. I don't think he's bigoted against Venezuela. I don't know, but I would assume that he's not. His relationship with Washington would be transactional and security first. He's the candidate most likely to aggressively resume extraditions and pursue counter-narcotics cooperation with U.S. agencies. Now, what about corruption? Who will actually fight it and against whom? Let's be direct. Every candidate promises to fight corruption. The more interesting question is which corruption they'll fight and which they'll ignore. Cepeda promises merciless action against corporate and right-wing state corruption, and he has a track record of genuinely pursuing those cases. His years of work documenting paramilitary links to politicians was serious investigative work. The problem is his consistent blind eye towards the corruption within the Petro administration itself. When Ecopetrol's the Colombian state-controlled oil company, Ricardo Roa, who was he just kind of went on, like, they put him on a leave of absence, but basically he's out of there. He not only was the head of Ecopetrol, he got appointed that by Petro, but he was Petro's presidential campaign manager. But when he, was charged, so he's been charged, indicted for alleged crimes, corruption, the Petro camp's response was notably muted. Of course, he's Petro's pal and friend, and they're not out there. They really don't. They tend to stay loyal, and this is, not just Petro, but the people a lot of times on the right do this as well. Uribe is famous for doing this with some of his people that have been caught up in scandals. They don't. They tend to stick by people even when you are, like, clearly you've done something wrong. But Cepeda's anti-corruption credentials are real to a limit, and they're certainly biased and ideologically filtered, leaving some huge blind spots. Valencia favors structural institutional oversight, digital transparency in public bidding, which is good, strengthening the Contraloría, which is like the Colombian. So in Colombia, you have these two entities that supervise public officials and public action. So you have the Procuraduría, which is like a, you would translate it as ombudsman, but what they really do is they're like prosecutors for public officials. So you have the regular prosecutor that's just like you robbed a bank and they'll throw you in jail. And then you have the Procuraduría, and they're the ones that can remove you from public office. Okay, so they investigate public officials. And then you have the Contraloría, which is like the auditor. So it's like the national auditor. Okay, and their job is to look for corruption and inefficiency in public bidding and public contracting. And so those two entities then work together. And she also would support ostensibly the Fiscalía, which is the Attorney General's office, as independent institutions, and removing the executive branch's informal levers over the justice system. She says this, maybe her legislative record supports this, and certainly if she were to carry this out, it would be a good thing. Her approach is technocratic rather than prosecutorial, and she's less likely, I think, to weaponize the judiciary against political opponents, but also perhaps less likely to generate the dramatic corruption takedowns that make headlines. De la Espriella advocates for draconian criminal sentences for corrupt officials, which sounds great until you examine his client list, which we're about to do. The uncomfortable question, De la Espriella and his clients. So that's a big elephant in his room. Abelardo de la Espriella built one of Colombia's most successful criminal defense practices, representing some of the most controversial figures in the country's modern history. This is public record, documented extensively by El Colombiano, El Espectador, and the investigative outlet Corrupción al Día. His client roster includes Salvatore Mancuso, which is a big. His guy is such a mafia guy that he takes on an Italian nickname. Okay, nothing against Italians. I mean, he's picking on Italians by taking on this nickname. And De la Espriella, I think, is actually Italian descent, ancestry, as is Gustavo Petro, who may actually, I believe, Petro has an Italian passport, if I'm not mistaken. The Colombian president right now. So Salvador Mancuso was the former top commander of the AUC paramilitaries, the same paramilitary mafia responsible for thousands of civilian deaths. He represented multiple congressmen convicted in the Parapolitica scandal, and that's where basically the congressmen were in bed with figuratively, with these paracos, or with these paramilitary murderous mafia guys, okay? The systematic infiltration of Colombia's legislature. He represented David Murcio Guzman, the mastermind of the DMG pyramid scam that defrauded hundreds of thousands of Colombians. Former Bogota Mayor Claudia Lopez said this publicly on camera during the campaign. Este pisco robó a 200,000 colombianos. That guy stole from 200,000 Colombians. He represented the Nule family, convicted of massive state contract corruption. So you have the Carrusel de Contratos, which is a big... So if you go to Bogota and you'll see Avenida 26, also known as El Dorado, and that's the big road that goes to the airport. They robbed the city and the country blind, the Nule family did, building that road. And they finally got locked up. But who was their savior, who did all he could to keep them out of jail, or to get them out of jail, was De La Espriella. And most damaging for his anti-left credentials, he was the attorney for Alex Saab. Alex Saab, who was born in Colombia. He's the Colombian businessman who was like Nicolas Maduro's fixer, and the guy in that clap program in Venezuela where they were stealing all the money for whatever Maduro wanted. And the U.S. snatches him because his plane landed in Tenerife or in the Canary Islands or somewhere in the Azores or somewhere. I think it was the Canary Islands to refuel. And the U.S. nabbed him. They got the government over there to cooperate with them and handed over Alex Saab. So then Maduro has all these people, Americans, just random people who are down there doing business on petroleum. There's this old retired guy who's selling around the Caribbean in a sailboat, and Maduro snatched him. And then a couple people went over the border, because there's no law against going to Venezuela. So if I wanted to go to Venezuela right now, I could go. That would be like an incredibly stupid thing to do because they might grab me. Right now, they probably wouldn't. But, people's like, I'm going to go to Venezuela and visit family. And they, you have an American passport, or, they just snap. And they grabbed him to be bargaining chips because they wanted to get Alex Saab back. Eventually, there was a prisoner exchange. They got Alex Saab back. But now, after the U.S. nabbed Maduro, and Delcy Rodriguez is over there kind of cooperating, they've given Alex Saab back up. So now he's back in the U.S. But anyway, his main defender or advocate, now his goose is cooked now. He's in the U.S. He's going to be served up and forget it. And he's already convicted. So they just locked him back up in jail, I guess. But anyway, who's his defense attorney? Abelardo de la Espriella. So there you go. But according to the publication Corrupción al Día, De La Espriella's fees from Saab included private jet travel and reportedly reached $12 million. Now, De La Espriella's counter-argument is the one any good defense attorney would make. Everyone deserves vigorous legal representation. The rule of law requires it, and his ability to navigate complex criminal codes proves his capacity to enforce the law from the presidential palace. This is a legitimate philosophical argument. John Adams, the U.S. president, second president, I always confuse who was second. Was it him or Jefferson? I think it was John Adams and then Jefferson. I could be wrong. Tell me in the comments. John Adams defended British soldiers after the Boston Massacre. Okay, the best criminal defense attorneys in any country know the law better than most prosecutors. But here's the problem that goes beyond the philosophical. Representing Alex Saab, Maduro's fixer, makes De La Espriella's fiercely anti-Venezuelan, anti-leftist platform look, at minimum, hypocritical. The Espriella firm knew what Saab was. Now, counter-argument. If you're a defense attorney, you probably aren't going to go around not defending anybody because you might think he's guilty, because, we've talked about this. Guilty people need lawyers even, no, innocent people actually need lawyers more than guilty people, but they all need lawyers. And if you believe in the kind of governmental principles and philosophies that we have in places like really throughout most of the Americas today, thankfully, there's a few places that don't comply like Cuba and Nicaragua, but U.S., Canada, Colombia, Chile, Uruguay, then people deserve a competent defense attorney, whoever they are, whether they're innocent or guilty, because you've got to go through the legal process, at least in theory, at least what we learn in kind of civics class in school. The way it's supposed to work is you go through the legal process, right? And innocence, you defend your innocence. For that, you need a defense attorney. And if you're guilty, you try to get the best deal you can. You need a defense attorney for that. So he would argue, and it's a legitimate argument, that I'm a defense attorney. If you choose that career, it's just like, you see some kind of axe murderer or mass killer or somebody, they're going to get a lawyer. And then you see in public, like on the news, you see people like boo and they're mad at the lawyer. I get it on an emotional level, but and the lawyer, if he or she is a good lawyer, is going to do the best he or she can and vigorously represent their candidate. And then we can be mad because we can say, oh, yeah, but he's a bad guy and he's a shooter, or, Richard Dahmer back in the U.S. ate people and had them in the freezer. Okay, you deserve an defense attorney. And so if you believe that, we can't be the hypocrites and then say we're going to be mad at him because he did that. Now, should we talk about it? Yeah, that's fine, I think. But there's a legitimate discussion to be had. Let's leave it at that. For compliance officers at multinational companies, for U.S. government interlocutors considering counter-narcotics cooperation, and for foreign institutional investors, that proximity to an elite-level money laundering and paramilitarism. Now, you can look at De La Espriella. He's represented Salvador Mancuso on the right. The Paracos, you can call them death squads, even though they weren't death squads in the sense like you had in let's say Nicaragua or in El Salvador in Central America. But they have kind of moved into becoming morphed into a mafia in Colombia, persistent mafia. But then he's left, I don't know if you call Saab a Bolshevik because he was a super money maker in the defense of the Maduro regime, which claims to be socialist or Bolivarian republic or whatever. But it's really just a robber government. It's not, they like to use that, Marxist rhetoric, but they never, even really seriously tried to implement any kind of Marxism. So again, it's not disqualifying. Colombia has had presidents with complicated histories, but if you are an investor or if you are a diplomat or somebody who's doing business or has ties, it is, like I said, it's a legitimate discussion to talk about. Now, on the other side, we have just like on one hand, on the other hand, well, here we go. The Cepeda family tree has some interesting implications. Opponents of Ivan Cepeda regularly cite his family history as evidence of ideological alignment with guerrilla movements. This needs to be examined honestly rather than just deployed as a political attack. First, the facts. Ivan Cepeda is the son of Manuel Cepeda Vargas, who was Secretary General of the Colombian Communist Party and a senator for the Unión Patriótica, the UP. The UP was they're still around, even though there's not very many of them, a left-wing party, a far-left party, I think it would be fair to say, that was systematically exterminated by a joint operation of state actors and paramilitary groups throughout the 1980s and 1990s. What happened, and I'm not a super expert on this, but I think that they had convinced some people that had been in the FARC to lay down their arms and come and participate in politics. And they did, but and Colombia has a long history, a sad history of political violence. Even the two dominant parties for much of Colombia's history, the liberals and conservatives, would just go at each other Not the big bosses in the cities. The cities were relatively peaceful, but in the countryside. And it wasn't really ideological. It wasn't like I'm liberal because I believe in separation of church and state, and I'm conservative because it was like you're almost genetic. Like your family's a liberal family and your family's a conservative family. And if you left, like if you just disagreed, then you're probably ousted from the family. It was like this, and it was really a mess. And so there has been this plague of political violence. And so I think that a certain segment of society has gotten used to it. So then when the UP said, we're going to not be FARC and we're going to try to this vote thing, they were hunted down and killed throughout the cities. And that's true. And so it was like, well, screw this. Let's go back and get guns and be the FARC again, right? But this happened back in the 80s and the 90s. And so Manuel Cepeda Vargas was assassinated on August 9th, 1994. And the Inter-American Court of Human Rights later found the Colombian state responsible for his murder. The FARC-EP subsequently named its western bloc the Bloque Occidental after Manuel Cepeda Vargas. So there's a FARC unit, or was, named after Cepeda's dad, okay? So this is the history that figures like Enrique Gomez, leader of Salvación Nacional, which is a party, used to argue that Iván Cepeda is an ideological front for guerrilla interests, okay? The more complete picture documented by the Fundación Paz and Reconciliación Paris, which is a peace group. Iván Cepeda studied in Bulgaria in 1981, which kind of blows my mind because that was super mega Soviet Warsaw Pact communist bloc back then. And upon returning, he broke ideologically with his father's rigid Soviet-style communism. He aligned instead with democratic leftists, specifically with Bernardo Jaramillo Osa. I don't know. This is just what I found in my research. I don't know much about it. I didn't go down that rabbit hole, or I'd still be, I'm getting this to you later than I wanted to anyway, who openly and publicly rejected the FARC's armed struggle. Cepeda has repeatedly and publicly repudiated the FARC's use of his father's name. He's not a guerrilla sympathizer in any operational sense. I mean, he's probably not like under the table working with the FARC, like there's some kind of secret way into the government or anything. There's no evidence of that. What he is, and this matters enormously for the business and investment community. I mean, he's an avowed leftist, but it's just like, within Soviet times, you had the Stalinists hunted down and killed Trotsky. So they're all Bolsheviks. And remember, the Bolsheviks hunted down and got rid of the Mensheviks, who were like the moderates, who didn't want to have this kind of what the Soviet Union became, but they wanted to get rid of the Tsars. But Cepeda is a man who has spent his adult life in the ideological framework shaped by this family trauma. And yes, you could say kind of a leftist, socialist, maybe it would even be fair to say Marxist kind of ideological framework. And the belief that the Colombian state's institutional violence is at least as dangerous as guerrilla violence, and that negotiated settlements are morally and practically superior to military solutions. Now, you have people, and Petro, I think, falls into this camp, who don't see and a lot of people think this way. I don't necessarily, but a lot of people have the legitimate opinion, or I say legitimate, I mean, it's their honest opinion. I don't mean I agree with it or whatever, that there's no difference between, let's say, what the military does and what Marxist rebels do. And while the military does, and has committed abuses and atrocities or whatever, when the military is working the way that it is supposed to serve the public. Now, like I just said, it does not always do that. If there is an insurgency or an insurrection, and sometimes you can argue that there are good insurrections. There's that saying that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. The U.S. was founded by insurrectionists, right? So I guess it depends on whose side you're on. But I think that when in Colombia you say that the armed forces, if I'm some guy in the Air Force or some guy in the Colombian Navy trying to stop crime or shenanigans or whatever, to put them on a moral equivalence of these people that are out here, kidnapping kids and terrorizing the countryside and manufacturing poison. I don't think that's I think that's very disingenuous. It's my opinion. Okay. If I'm wrong, argue with me in the comments. But that idea that these people are morally equivalent, I think, is a core principle, not necessarily stated that way, of Paz Total, of Gustavo Petro and Ivan Cepeda's Paz Total policy. And it produces a security policy that prioritizes dialogue over force, even when dialogue isn't working. These armed groups right now in Colombia are making a mockery. Just here, like, I wouldn't say walking distance, but probably 15 minutes away in a car. Just a few weeks ago, the ELN, somebody had put up an ELN banner on the side of the road. And they're not really a danger in this area where I am yet. But the security situation, they were an endangered species before these guerrilla terrorists. And now they're coming back stronger than ever under this administration's Paz total peace policy. So that idea may produce a president who will be genuinely sympathetic, perhaps excessively sympathetic in my estimation. Hopefully I'm wrong if he wins, to the ELN and FARC dissident negotiators on the other side of the table. Now, does Cepeda have direct family ties to current FARC or militant operations? Probably not. There's no documented evidence that I've seen or that I could find that supports that claim. But his ideological DNA makes him the candidate most likely to extend extraordinary patience to these armed actors in ways that benefit those actors operationally. On the question of Daniel Quintero and Alvaro Uribe, so Uribe is an indicted criminal on one side, and Daniel Quintero, the former mayor of Medellin, is an indicted, I don't want to get in trouble and say criminal because Uribe's been convicted. Quintero is under investigation, is under indictment, and I can get in trouble if I say criminal because he hasn't been convicted yet, or he hasn't been convicted, okay? But a Cepeda presidency offers zero cover to Uribe. And remember, Cepeda, this spat between Cepeda and Uribe is how Uribe ended up getting convicted. So what happens is back when they were both senators and Uribe couldn't stay out of politics. So after he was president, he goes and gets into the Senate. And he accuses Cepeda of like paying bribes to people to falsely accuse Uribe. Supreme Court investigates, the high court. So in Colombia, you have basically three different Supreme Courts. You have the Corte Constitucional that looks at, laws to see if they that Congress passes to see if those laws follow the constitutions. Then you have the Council of State, which investigates what the executive branch does. And then you have the Supreme Court, which just investigates crime. Now, Uribe, what happened was when they go to investigate this claim that Uribe made against Cepeda, the court found that because the only one that can investigate, I think in Congress, the Constitutional Court has to investigate them. They found actually that Cepeda had not made up stuff about Uribe, but Uribe and his lawyer had made up stuff about Cepeda. So Uribe ends up getting indicted and eventually convicted for what he blamed Cepeda for. So these two guys hate each other. I don't know their hearts. They're enemies. They're their opponents or they're nemesis of each other. And Uribe is, he got convicted. He was sentenced to jail, to prison. But his conviction or his sentence got overturned. And so he's out now, kind of. He even ran for Senate this last time, but he lost. But the situation now is that the overturning of his sentence is now under active investigation. We've got an article in it this week in Finance Colombia. Check it out. I won't get into it here. FinanceColombia.com. And basically, Uribe cannot expect any sympathy, at least from the executive branch. If Cepeda wins, you can expect that. Quintero, maybe so. Now, you don't have a whole lot of direct levers that you can pull, and you don't really, Colombia does have separations of power, so you can't, there's not a whole lot that Cepeda can do for Quintero. But on the other hand, if, let's say, De La Espriella, who has represented Alvaro Uribe before they know each other. Cepeda has stated he's a loyal fan of Alvaro Uribe, and Uribe has been a client of Cepeda. However, Cepeda is not in Uribe's party, Centro Democrático. Uribe's candidate is Paloma Valencia. Okay, they probably would not do much to help Daniel Quintero. Quintero's hope has to be that Cepeda wins if he's going to have a chance of beating the charges that are out there against him. So for allied left-wing politicians facing legal trouble, Cepeda would likely support institutional protection or amnesty frameworks. That's the honest read. Those Pisces who want to see Quintero locked up will probably be heartbroken under a Cepeda presidency. Now we have to ask, is Paloma Valencia an Uribe sock puppet? And this is one of the most persistent questions about her candidacy, and it's fair. The memory of Ivan Duque is fresh, a president who was a president before Gustavo Petro, so visibly managed by Uribe that political cartoonists would think of him as a ventriloquist dummy. But let's look at the actual comparison. Duque was a relatively obscure Washington-educated technocrat when Uribe handpicked him. Ivan Duque, Colombian president, but Duque has really spent most of his life in Washington, most of his adult life in Washington. And he's back in Washington now, as far as I can tell. Somebody saw him. I'm serious. I'm not joking. I'm not like saying this in a mocking way. And if you do, then cool, it's fine. Because what is the head of one of the big investment banks in the U.S. is like he spends his nights DJing in nightclubs. But Ivan Duque was DJing somewhere in Cartagena in a nightclub. And if that's your thing, then great. Everybody deserves a hobby. And if you can rock the house and, then rock the wheels of steel, then go for it. If you can rock the mic, then go for it. But my point is that when Uribe selected Duque, he had almost no independent political base. He was unknown. He owed everything to Uribe's machine and governed accordingly, or rather failed to govern independently precisely because of that dependency. Paloma Valencia is a different animal, a different political animal. She is the granddaughter of former Colombian President Guillermo León Valencia. She has her own political dynasty and her own support base. She's been a senator for over a decade. She's built her own distinct brand, including positions on agrarian reform, judicial modernization, and indigenous land rights that have put her at odds with standard Centro Democrático Uribista orthodoxy. She won the Gran Consulta por Colombia on March 8th with over 45% of the vote. More than 3.2 million Colombians voted for her. That was like a primary that they held. And it doesn't work exactly like primaries tend to work in the U.S., but it essentially was a primary that was held back in March to decide who would be the flag-bearing candidate for that party. So she has a mandate that Duque never had before he was elected. Will she defend Uribe personally? Absolutely. She's done so throughout her Senate career. She is a Uribe loyalist, not as much an ideology as she is in kind of like a personal. It's sort of, I get the impression that she feels like she owes him something. So she seems to be kind of personally loyal to him. And will she exert pressure through legal channels and political rhetoric to affect the trajectory of the cases against him? Almost certainly. It's a prediction, it's a guess, but I would suspect so. But would she be an outright puppet who cannot govern without Uribe's sign-off? The evidence of her legislative career says no. She has enough political capital of her own to resist that dynamic and can show, in many cases, when she has voted at odds with the Uribista meaning Uribe, Alvaro Uribe supporters' orthodoxy. Moving on, somebody asked, are there any libertarian candidates in the race? And the short answer is no. But here's where we need to be clear, because this election is being framed in the international press in ways that confuse economic libertarianism with political authoritarianism. And people, this annoys me. People do this with Javier Milei down in Argentina. He's not a libertarian. People say, he's libertarian. No, he's not. He's more libertarian than the Peronist or the Kirchners in that group, but he's not really a libertarian in any kind of traditional sense. He might be libertarian aligned. That's to say, if you're a libertarian in Argentina, you probably would, find him less noxious than the Kirchners. But true libertarianism, as defined by the Cato Institute, by the tradition of Hayek and Friedman, or by the Colombian Libertad and Progreso think tank, has two inseparable pillars: economic freedom and civil liberties. You cannot call yourself libertarian. Well, you can do what you want, free speech, but you're probably not, and I would agree with this, you're not libertarian if you advocate for mass detention without due process, the suspension of innocent until proven guilty as a political philosophy and as practice, and a state powerful enough to override individual rights in the name of security. De la Espriella's platform fails this test comprehensively. His Bukele-style mega prison proposal, his advocacy for arbitrary mass detentions, and his willingness to suspend civil liberties to fight cartels are to a genuine libertarian as alarming as anything Cepeda promises. A state powerful enough to imprison criminals without due process is a state powerful enough to imprison anyone. Libertarians, and this point is not made enough in Latin American political discourse, are fundamentally uncomfortable with strongman security states, even when those states are targeting genuinely bad people. And that's the situation we have here with these guerrillas and these mafias and corrupt politicians. The candidate whose platform is most consistent with institutional economic liberalism is not libertarianism. They're related and they maybe are aligned in certain ways. But when I say economic liberalism, I mean free markets, reduced state apparatus, respect for civil liberties and individual rights, would be Paloma Valencia, specifically because of Juan Daniel Oviedo. Oviedo's technocratic program: remove structural market distortions, slash the state bureaucracy, respect individual civil liberties, let markets function. That's small government conservatism. It's not exciting. It doesn't generate viral social media content. But for a serious libertarian-leaning investor or economic liberal, it's the most coherent program in this race. That is not an endorsement. I'm not endorsing anybody. I'm careful about that because I don't feel that it is my place either as a journalist or as I'm not Colombian. As somebody from the U.S., I sometimes get annoyed when I hear people saying what should happen in the U.S., even when they agree with me sometimes, because it's like, it's none of your business, So I'm here to analyze this. I'm not here to make an endorsement or say who I like or dislike or who you should vote for. I don't think that that's my place. I am not afraid to share my opinions on what I think about candidates, but this does not reflect the opinion of Finance Colombia staff. There are people who may disagree with me at all. I'm just saying, hey, here's my honest opinion about what is going on and what is likely to happen and what the options are in front of us. Cepeda, to state the obvious, represents the most statist vision in this election. State-directed economics, wealth redistribution, state monopoly, ambitions in healthcare and pensions, agrarian collectivism. These are not compatible with economic liberalism in any meaningful sense. And it's interesting because, and I don't know how far he would go down the road of agrarian collectivism, but Mao tried that and starved millions of Chinese. Stalin tried that and starved millions of people in the Soviet Union. That doesn't work. So maybe, he might want to do something that's more akin to the way that we have farmers cooperatives in the U.S., and these are great. We have like Land of Lakes Butters, Land of Lakes, or Cabot Cheese, which is, I love their cheese. And Cabot, so you have these farmer-owned cooperative companies. And mutual insurance companies sort of work that way, but the concept is different. They're owned by their policyholders. So there's all of these kind of different economic structures that are very effective and very fair. You also have, I don't see this a lot in Latin America, but in the U.S. we have employee-owned companies that are really cool and an idea that I think would work well in Latin America. But Cepeda is the furthest from any libertarian conception of government or libertarian concept of government. Now, let me be crystal clear. It would be laughable to say Paloma Valencia is a libertarian. She's something of a center-right traditional candidate for Latin America. My point is that a libertarian might find her the least noxious of the three. True libertarians are harder to find in Latin America than polar bears. Now, moving on to a subject near and dear to me, press freedom. Who will best tolerate criticism? This matters for our audience because press freedom correlates strongly with rule of law, which correlates with investment environment quality. Okay, so when you have a thriving press that can root out corruption, that can criticize and hold the government to account, then you're generally looking at a place that's going to be not just a better place to live, but a better place to do business, and a place where investors are going to be able to get more accurate, honest information that makes the place a more desirable investment destination. Cepeda proclaims democratic norms, but he has adopted Petro's practice of labeling critical media as bourgeois, biased, or fascist from the presidential platform. Under Petro, this produced a systematic exclusion of critical outlets from official information flows and a relentless rhetorical campaign to delegitimize independent journalists. Petro has been at battle with the traditional press kind of since taking office, and he'll go and say something kind of crazy, and then everybody reports it, and then he gets mad at the people who report it. But if he doesn't like what you say, he says that you're a tool of the mafia, controlled by the rascally capitalist. And, basically he's very hostile to anyone that might point out a logical inconsistency in something that he says, or ask hard questions. Cepeda might continue this pattern. The press would remain legally free, but politically harassed. Valencia, and there's an organization, FLIP, the Fundación for Libertad, and it's like I don't know what the initials are, but it's basically Fundación Libertad and Independencia en Prensa. So the Foundation for Free and Independent Press in Colombia, and they're always filing complaints against Petro because of his insults and attacks on Twitter, which is his favorite toy, his attacks against journalists. Paloma Valencia operates comfortably within institutional bounds. She has spent her career in an environment of vigorous press criticism. Centro Democrático has been relentlessly covered, often unfavorably, by Colombia's major outlets. I would say in most cases deservedly so. There's some things that you can criticize them about. And she engages substantively rather than attacking the messenger. Valencia administration would restore the professional relationship between the executive and the press. De la Espriella has already shown his hand. He has called journalist Maria Lucia Fernandez of Caracol Noticias, one of the major news networks in Colombia, ignorant in a live broadcast. He's faced accusations of inappropriate conduct, harassment, gender-related or sexual harassment towards journalist Laura Rodriguez of Piso Ocho FM, and issued an apology. I don't remember if he was compelled to issue an apology or he just got so much backlash against his behavior that he just figured it would be a good thing to come out and do. He views traditional media through a populist lens and would pursue a Trump Malay-style strategy of bypassing mainstream outlets in favor of direct digital communication while publicly vilifying outlets that challenge him. He's famously thin-skinned. He uses his advantage as a lawyer. He has a track record of suing people who say something he doesn't like. And even though you might not win, I think they call these in the US, I think they call these slap lawsuits. But basically, I'm going to sue you to like make your life miserable and cost you a whole bunch of money because you've got to defend yourself, even though I know I probably won't win the case. And the idea is that not that he's going to win the case, but he's going to scare other journalists in the future from, making comments or negative comments or criticizing him, because it's going to be a kind of a chilling environment. You're going to be scared to, because even though you think you're right, it's just not worth it to go and get sued and have to pay for lawyers and that kind of thing. So you could argue that he has abused his position as a lawyer when he does that. He may not censor the press in any kind of formal legal sense, but the operational environment for critical journalism would be certainly hostile. And who would be most likely to revoke the visa of a foreign journalist like me? I would have to guess Espriella. Not saying that there is any imminent danger of that should he win, but my hunch is that he would be the most likely to use his discretionary power over migration as a purview of the executive branch if he really gets pissed off with any journalist. Now, we're not, activist crusaders. That's not really our journalistic forte or editorial focus. So we probably would not be the first in line for retribution. But there are groups, let's say, journalists that are very allied with the left, or investigative reporters. I would worry most about those kinds of muckrakers and those who root out corruption and hold government to account, which is a very, very valuable role of government. I forget if it was Thomas Jefferson. I think it might have been Benjamin Franklin. I'm pretty sure it was Thomas Jefferson who said, if I had to choose between living in a place where there was no government or a place where there was no press, I would choose the place that had no government, because it's scarier to live in a place where you have no press or no free media. And I'm not an anarchist, and I don't want to live in an anarchy, and I don't believe in anarchy as a viable. I mean, basically, it's going back to the Stone Age. Okay, but the idea is that the role of the media. Now, maybe we're self-important. Maybe we just think this because we're media, right? So you have to throw that in there. But really, it's important that we have a critical press, whoever we are and wherever we are. So quickly, moving on, I want to take a quick tour and be respectful of the rest of the ballot. There are a few other candidates that are still on the ballot that are not the top three in the polls. Claudia Lopez, who is the former mayor of Bogota, she's running under Con Claudia Imparable, which means with Claudia Unstoppable, is probably the candidate who deserves more credit than her poll numbers suggest. She's a genuine progressive centrist, I think would be the way to describe her. She has a serious anti-corruption track record. Her problem is structural. She is trying to capture moderate left voters who are being pulled by the Cepeda machine's organizational strength. Her strength is in Bogota, and she doesn't have much because she's the mayor in Bogota, and she doesn't have much strength outside of or presence outside of Bogota traditionally. And she has high polarization numbers from her time as mayor, where her management of the city was controversial. She would go after people, and she in Colombia they say you talk sin pelos en la lengua, without hair on your tongue, and basically it's kind of like you tell it as it is, or you don't hold back. And she does have kind of a style that doesn't bother me, but it can rub some people the wrong way. She has, also attacked De La Espriella directly and aggressively during debates, calling him a defensor de la mafia, a defender of the mafia, which is factually grounded, but also reveals her preference for political combat over coalition building. She, she's not broken 3.5% in any major poll. I actually think Claudia did a decent job, like I said, of mayor, but not perfect, but competent. She didn't hesitate to cross swords with Gustavo Petro either. And at first that surprised me. I thought they would be more aligned, but because she kind of is sort of like on the left, not like a Bolshevik super left, Trotskyite or anything like that. But she really and Petro would get into it, and I don't think they like each other anymore. I think that they were aligned at one point, but he might see it as lack of loyalty, but she might see it as, him making a mockery of the progressive movement, you could say. But anyway, they seem to have fallen out. Sergio Fajardo making his third consecutive presidential run under Dignidad y Compromiso, his political movement. Fajardo's story is one. There's an interesting interview. He's fluent in English, and there's an old interview, a Charlie Rose interview, and I'll try to find the link so that we can share it with you. But it's way old now. It might be 20 years old, but it's a really cool interview to listen to Fajardo talk. His story is one of the more kind of poignant in Colombian politics. He's a genuinely well-respected professor. He's a math professor turned politician in his moment. He was the mayor of Medellin and had, did a lot of things that were very well respected, both domestically and internationally. His transformation work in the city, the urban renewal work and urban transformation in the early 2000s was internationally celebrated. But in an election, this kind of election defined by fierce polarization, he's kind of a mild-mannered technocratic. Well, he's a university math professor. Okay, so take that stereotype, if you will. His centrism struggles to generate the emotional momentum that you kind of need to break through. And people have in the past mocked him as being wishy-washy. Like I remember saying, there was like a joke, and it was like, what would the candidate, and it wasn't this election, it was a previous one, what would he do about this? And they said that Fajardo would say, well, first it would, but then it wouldn't. And he's like, he's really what you need. I'm not saying what Colombia needs right now, but he's the kind of person that understands nuance and that understands that things are gray area, not all just black or white, or not all just this or that. But that doesn't always sell well politically. Right? Because people want hard chargers, or people. I talked to a friend who likes Espriella because of his oratory style and his oratory capability. And I try to explain to her, well, you could be a great orator, but hell, Hitler gave great speeches, at least to the people who followed him. You can go and watch those old fiery speeches back then. And I thought he sounded kind of like a nut, but, I'm not caught under his spell, right? And so the best candidates, and I'm not talking about anybody in particular, are not necessarily the ones who can give the fiery speeches, but those that can, in some respects, make politics boring again, or those that are good at governing. I think of George H.W. Bush, not the son, but the father who came after Reagan, and he was a horrible candidate. He hated campaigning. I think that he probably was a better president, or would have been a better president than he got credit for, but he was kind of nerdy. You could tell he hated campaigning. He did not connect well with people, but maybe as a statesman, or maybe as somebody who, and you can disagree with me, but I think that he's the example of somebody that was not the fiery orator. He did not have the charisma of Reagan, who came before him, or of Bill Clinton, who came after. They were both much better communicators and speakers. But as a policy person, I think that this is the same problem that Fajardo has had, that has kept him from more success beyond the local level in Colombia. Fajardo remains below 3.5% in the polls. So he's continued to run campaign after campaign. Roy Barreras, a veteran political entrepreneur running under the La Fuerza, who he participated in kind of the left. They had their sort of multi-party primary where all the people on the left kind of ran, and he bombed in that, but decided to keep his campaign going. So he's coming off of his Frente por la Vida primary victory. Well, he actually ran, and he actually got a tiny amount of the votes, but he got the most to qualify for his little piece of things. So he got enough to qualify to be a candidate. And so he's one of the most flip-floppy political operators in Colombia that I've ever seen. He has been part of virtually every major coalition in the last 2 decades. He's with the conservatives, then he's with the liberals. He's like whoever wins or whoever's going to win, he's like, yeah, I'm with them. Okay. I mean, geez, it's like, do you stand for anything? Yeah, I stand for, my own pension or my own political future. Same thing with Armando Benedetti, who is now the interior minister under Gustavo Petro, but Benedetti at least got appointed and to his position. But I see, my personal opinion is Barreras is one of these guys who just is like wants to just make a career out of politics. That's why I call him a political entrepreneur. No real core beliefs, but opportunism. That's my opinion. Okay, so maybe I don't know the man, and if I'm wrong, you can tell me why I'm wrong and say, no, he's really a nice guy and he's my neighbor. So let me know. Miguel Uribe Londoño, no relation to Alvaro Uribe. Uribe is a common name in Colombia, okay, like Escobar. It's just a name, or like Castro, okay? Not every Castro is Fidel. Miguel Uribe Londoño is running under the Partido Democrático, which means the Democrat Party. No relation, as far as I know, to the Democrat Party in the U.S. But this party is supposed to represent a younger generation of the traditional right. Now, you still have in Colombia the Conservative Party, but they're not fielding a candidate this time. The two parties, the Liberal Party, and that's what they're called, and the Conservative Party, traditionally have been the dominant parties in Colombia, but they haven't had a candidate really do well forever. Like for the last couple of decades. Alvaro Uribe used to be a liberal from the Liberal Party. Now, that doesn't mean liberal in like the sense of some kind of leftist or anything like that in Colombia. It doesn't mean that. But you're more liberal than the Conservative Party, which is like they want the church to have an official role in government and society. And, most of the conservative platforms would be not just anti-abortion, but anti-birth control. That's those sort of positions. And then the Liberal Party, which 80 years ago, you would have considered to be maybe on the left in Colombia, but their positions were not like pro-communist or pro-Marxist or anything, but maybe separation of church and state, maybe more of a classical liberal type of movement away from the strict traditional kind of ideology that you had in the 1800s and in the 20th century. Today, I guess you could say they're moderates, but anyway, so people like Alvaro Uribe, his family came from the Liberal Party, and again, today they're not liberal compared to like a Marxist kind of party or far left party or the Greens or anything like that. But Uribe Londoño, his son, Miguel Uribe Turbay, was the one who was killed last year, was assassinated when he was giving his speech. And he had been a liberal candidate. I think he was on city council in Bogota. And Alvaro Uribe recruited him to join the Centro Democrático party. And so he got assassinated. So then his dad takes over the campaign. And but there's no real reason, or they have not articulated a reason to vote for him beyond the fact that in the memory of my son, I'm his dad, so vote for me because of that. Or he has, maybe there's more to his campaign, but he has not been able to effectively communicate that. So they're disciplined, anti-petro, pro-business, but a more conventional version of what Valencia represents, but without that personal political capital. And they're also polling below 3.5%. And now his son was a front runner when he was killed and probably would be the leading Centro Democrático candidate right now if he had not been assassinated. Then you have Carlos Caicedo. Carlos is running on a regionalist platform that appeals primarily to the Caribbean coast. And the Caribbean coast has been neglected traditionally by the powers that be in Bogota and Medellin. The Pacific coast, even worse than the Caribbean coast, okay? But Caicedo has kind of an agenda of decentralization and moving things out to the departments, giving more power and budget to the departments. And that itself, he makes a good point. Colombia is, in my opinion, over-centralized in Bogota, and there is a genuine governance problem, but the national profile of this candidate, Caicedo, is not there. He was the mayor of Santa Marta, which is the third largest city on the Caribbean coast. You have Barranquilla, then Cartagena, then Santa Marta. It's a lovely vacation spot, especially the natural beauty outside of the city. And he was the governor of Magdalena. Magdalena is the department where Santa Marta is. Okay, so my impression is that he's a pretty far left guy, but to be fair, I haven't really looked into him or his campaign very closely. So what's the bottom line? Let's bring this home and let's be direct about what the updated polling picture means for our audience. The scenario that many in the international investment community may have been quietly planning around, a Cepeda versus Valencia runoff, is looking increasingly unlikely. Based on what we know as of this weekend, it is now more probable than not that Abelardo de la Espriella is on the candidate, the two candidates that will make it to the runoff, and he will face Cepeda on June 21st. And that changes the calculus in important ways. For the international investment community, for multinational businesses, and really for people of any background, whether they are Colombians or whether they are people like me who I'm not Colombian, but I have close ties to Colombia, and I've staked invested a big part of my life here, well over a decade, and want the best for the country. Here's the straight read on each outcome. So a Cepeda victory, which remains the most probable single outcome if you only look at the numbers right now, the first round numbers, means a continuation of the Petro-era economic model. You're looking at sustained capital outflow pressure, high corporate tax burdens, a freeze on new fossil fuel exploration contracts, and you may see that as a good or bad thing, continued labor reform cost, and a foreign policy that tilts away from Washington and toward Beijing and Moscow. The peso remains under pressure. Ecopetrol doesn't get new contracts. The mining licensing backlog grows. If you're an extractive and thinking about whether to expand Colombian operations, a Cepeda victory is the signal to hold, not to accelerate. That said, and this is important, a Cepeda win is not a Venezuela scenario. A lot of people thought that when Petro got elected, and people asked me, and people were scared, Colombians and foreigners, oh, it's going to turn into Venezuela. It's not, and it hasn't. Okay, there is enough institutionalism and separation of powers, and the history and the structure of the two countries are very different. The worst case scenario when Petro got elected did not happen. The country has not turned into Venezuela. It has not turned into some kind of Marxist workers' paradise, and I say that sarcastically. And the biggest, most aggressive changes that Petro wanted to make, he was unable to make. He has been unable to make so far. So Colombia's institutional framework, its independent central bank, its constitutional court are more resilient than the worst case scenario projections suggest, for those reasons I just stated. A Valencia victory would have been the cleanest pro-market signal in the race. If she somehow closes the gap and makes the runoff, and the Genesis CREA data from 3 weeks ago suggests she was the strongest right-wing runoff candidate, a Valencia second-round victory triggers an immediate relief rally. Ecopetrol exploration contracts move, the mining backlog starts clearing, Washington relationships normalize, the peso strengthens as risk premium falls. This outcome looks less likely than it did a month ago, but it's not impossible. A De la Espriella victory introduces what we might call a high dispersion scenario, meaning the range of possible outcomes is wider than either alternative. The upside is real former finance minister Jose Manuel Restrepo managing the economy with serious competence. He We might see genuine deregulation in the extractive sector, aggressive resumption of extraditions of criminals, and a security policy that, whatever its civil liberties problems are, is unambiguously hostile to the armed networks that have been choking off investments in places like Cauca, Norte de Santander, and Chocó as well. The bad guys in Colombia, mafia people and FARC people and narco people, don't like to get extradited to the U.S. for a lot of reasons. But I mean, I guess it makes it hard for their family to visit them, right? But in Colombia, they're notorious for being able to continue to run prisons or to run their criminal enterprises and operations from prisons. We've seen call centers operated out of prisons where they're extortion call centers, and they get their cell phones smuggled in. Colombia has cracked down on drone usage, especially for unlicensed drone operators. It's still legal in Colombia, but it's super restricted, and the importation of drone is restricted because people have been using drones. Like the criminals, they get their friends to fly stuff in using drones into the prison. So they go there, and people used to just throw them over the wall, but they're bringing in cell phones and booze and dope and everything, and they've gotten sophisticated and are using drones to do that. And they just had a big party at the prison. The people got busted down in Itagüí or down in the southern part of the southern suburbs of Medellin, where there's a big prison down there. And so when they get extradited to the U.S., they can't do that. It becomes much more complicated to try to run their criminal enterprises from behind bars. So the downside is also real. De la Espriella's combustible personal style creates diplomatic incidents. His past client relationships generate ongoing conflicts of interest, and the authoritarian dimensions of his security platform eventually may cross lines that trigger international human rights scrutiny. Restrepo's presence mitigates this risk premium, but it doesn't eliminate it. I could see Espriella getting into like a pissing match with some other foreign leaders, kind of like what Trump does. And so somebody says something, and then they start insulting each other over Twitter or that kind of nonsense. Maybe I'm misreading him. Maybe he won't do that. I don't know the man. But that's an impression I have, and I could be mistaken. I could be wrong, and he gets in there, and it's not going to be like that. And he can understand the gravity of the position and respect the office and treat it in a way that a presidency of a democracy deserves. Here is what the current polling trend tells us strategically. The right-wing electorate is consolidating around De la Espriella. Their traditional political establishment's preferred candidate, Paloma Valencia, is losing that consolidation fight. Voters on the right appear to be making the same calculation that voters in Argentina made when they chose Milei over more conventional conservative options. They want disruption, not management. So you had, I forget the guy's name, there had been other candidates outside of the Kirchners and outside of the Peronist group in Argentina, but they were not terribly effective. And the painful structural changes that actually Argentina probably needs, they didn't have the political juice to really sustain. And so I think, and this is just my opinion, that when the people in Argentina, those who went for Milei, it's not even so much that they liked him, but they were saying, ya basta, which in Spanish means all right, enough already, okay? And really, there was a critical mass of people that wanted to break free of that Peronist, Kirchnerist grip. And I think that led to the Milei phenomenon. And Espriella might be pulling into that zeitgeist. I think to some degree, even though I think that there are substantial differences, the whole Trump phenomena and the Tea Party phenomena before that was kind of like, we're tired of the same stuff. We're tired of the same milquetoast stuff, and things are becoming less affordable, and we find less of a route, a long-term path to success, and people are fed up. And that becomes disruptive. I think that, like where I live, which is very close to like I said, it's kind of in the heart of Uribe's support here in Antioquia and here in the sort of the Medellin area. I'm about an hour away from Medellin. This has traditionally been Uribe's base of support. He lives here. He lives, I could walk to his house. I don't know him. I've never met. I did meet the man once or twice, but I don't know him. He doesn't know who I am. But all I see outside are De La Espriella bumper stickers, and that's what people are sending me. So I think people are tired of Uribismo, the Uribe movement. He still has his supporters and he still has his loyalists, but the man is convicted of crimes. He is sentenced to crimes. His brother went to jail for being involved in political violence. The Doce Discípulos, they sound like these right wing. They made this right wing gang that went off and killed some people. That's what his brother was convicted of. And so I think that even people on the right are saying, yeah, I'm on the right, but I'm tired of the same old Uribe stuff. And they look back at the Ivan Duque administration, and a lot of people were very dissatisfied with how he ran things and saw him as a weak Uribe puppet. Even Maria Fernanda Cabal, who's a big Uribista, or at least he was up until he didn't select her for as the Centro Democrático's candidate, called Ivan Duque a mamerto, which is a strong insult in Colombian Spanish, when he was president. So even his own party had turned against him. So I guess it's not that surprising that even the Uribistas, or even people that traditionally would vote for the Uribista candidate, are saying, yeah, I'm not on the left, but I'm not going to go with you guys. And so at least you don't have the two-party limitation that you have, for example, in my home country. There are choices. So now, right now, you have three strong candidates, and there's not like a lock. It's not just two parties. We've got six candidates, and all three of them, none of them are from a traditional party. Hell, De La Espriella is not from a political party at all. He got on the ballot by going out and getting petitions signed, which is pretty damn impressive. So there you go. The question for the runoff is, if it's Cepeda versus De La Espriella, is whether enough moderate, center, and disenchanted voters break towards De La Espriella to overcome Cepeda's structural advantage. The Guarumo Ecoanalytical data suggests that Cepeda loses even that scenario. The Genesis CREA data, and these are pollsters and polling organizations, from earlier this month showed Cepeda winning it. The honest answer is we don't know yet, and we'll find out next Sunday. For companies already operating in Colombia, you can manage any of these outcomes. Colombia's institutional bedrock is real, I'm glad to say. For companies deciding whether to enter, particularly in energy and mining, a De La Espriella or Valencia victory is the green light. A Cepeda victory may be the signal to wait it out, or to structure your entry in a way that minimizes regulatory exposure during the transition. Who knows, though? We'll see. We've seen surprises in people that we thought were going to be hostile to an industry are friendly, and people that we thought would be friendly or hostile. The Santos administration was kind of famous for, even though they sort of spoke in a pro-business way, they held up a lot of licenses for the extractive sector, mining, for example. And for anyone who just wants to understand what kind of country Colombia is becoming, the answer is that this country is not sleepwalking into its future. Its voters are engaged, polarized, and choosing with real urgency. And the good thing is the polarization is not bipolar, but multipolar. And I think that is an advantage that Colombia has. Next Sunday, 7 weeks of intense campaigning comes to its first verdict. We'll have first round coverage here on Colombia Business News with Finance Colombia. Go to financecolombia.com. So we will certainly be on the case. And if it goes to a runoff, which will almost definitely be the case, we'll be back with the next chapter. I'm Lauren Moss for Finance Colombia. Read the full written version of this analysis at financecolombia.com. Of course, like and subscribe. Make sure you're getting our email newsletter and engage with us on social media. Links are below. See you on the other side of May 31st.